Okay, so here's what we're looking at tonight. Canada just signed a trade deal with China. Not a small one, not a symbolic gesture, a massive economy shifting agreement that fundamentally changes the balance of power in North America. And it happened because Donald Trump couldn't keep his mouth shut about tariffs. Let me walk you through exactly what went down because the implications of this are staggering. We're talking about the end of Canadian economic dependence on the United States. We're talking about a complete realignment of trade relationships that have existed for generations. And we're talking about Trump's threats literally backfiring in the most spectacular way possible. Around January 2026, Canada finalized this deal. The details are stunning. Canada dropped its tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to 6.1%. 6.1, they're allowing 49,000 Chinese EVs into Canada annually to start, growing to 70,000 over 5 years. In exchange, China lifted tariffs on Canadian canola, lobsters, beef, and peas. Canadian farmers who've been getting crushed by trade barriers suddenly have the world's largest market opening up to them. Now, Mark Carney's government is being very careful with the language here. They're not calling it a full free trade agreement. They're saying it's a targeted deal to fix specific trade issues. But let's be honest about what this actually is. This is Canada telling the United States that the days of economic blackmail are over. Here's where this gets really interesting. Trump threatened Canada with 100% tariffs. 100%. Do you understand what that means? That's not negotiation. That's economic warfare. That's telling your closest ally and trading partner that you're willing to destroy their economy to prove a point. And Carney looked at that threat and said, you know what? Fine. We'll find someone else to trade with. And they did. They went to China. Think about the strategic catastrophe this represents for American interests. For decades, the United States has maintained economic leverage over Canada because Canada needed access to American markets more than America needed access to Canadian markets. That dynamic just evaporated, gone, finished. Trump thought he was playing hardball. What he actually did was hand Canada the justification it needed to do something it probably wanted to do anyway, but couldn't politically justify. He made the case for Canadian trade diversification better than any Canadian politician ever could. He literally pushed Canada into China's arms. And the Chinese are thrilled about this. They get access to the North American market for their electric vehicles. They get to demonstrate to every other country in the world that there are alternatives to bowing to American economic pressure. They get to drive a wedge between the United States and its closest ally. This is a geopolitical win for China that they couldn't have orchestrated better if they'd written the script themselves. Let's talk about what this deal actually represents for Canada because this goes way beyond tariffs and trade numbers. This is about national sovereignty. This is about a country deciding it will not be held hostage anymore. For generations, Canadian economic policy has been constrained by one overwhelming reality. Whatever Canada wanted to do, it had to consider how the United States would react. Want to negotiate with another country? Better make sure Washington approves. Want to set your own trade policy? Better make sure it doesn't upset American interests. Want to chart your own course in the world? Too bad, because your economy is too dependent on American markets to risk retaliation. That constraint just got lifted. Carney's government has made it clear that they're aiming to dramatically increase non-U.S. exports by 2035. This China deal is step one. They're building an economic foundation that doesn't require American approval. They're creating leverage that Canada has never had before. And you can see the panic starting to set in south of the border because American policymakers are beginning to realize what they've lost here. They've lost the ability to unilaterally dictate terms to Canada. They've lost the assumption that Canada will always cave to American pressure because it has no other choice. They've lost the economic dominance that has defined the North American relationship for a century. Canadian farmers are celebrating tonight. The canola industry alone has been devastated by Chinese tariffs for years. Lobster fishermen in the Maritimes have been begging for access to Asian markets. Beef producers have been struggling with oversupply in North American markets. All of them just got access to a market of 1.4 billion people. This isn't just about economics. This is about Canada finally standing up and saying, "We are not your economic colony. We are not your subsidiary. We are a sovereign nation and we will trade with whoever we want." Now, let's dig into the specifics of this deal because the electric vehicle component is absolutely explosive. Canada is allowing Chinese EVs at a 6.1% tariff rate. Do you know what the tariff rate is in the United States for Chinese EVs? It's astronomical. The Biden administration kept Trump's tariffs in place and added more. The U.S. is trying to block Chinese electric vehicles completely. Canada just did the opposite. They opened the door. And this has massive implications for the entire North American auto industry because guess what? Canadians are going to be able to buy electric vehicles at prices that Americans can't access. The same car that costs $60,000 in Detroit might cost $40,000 in Toronto. The Canadian auto sector is obviously concerned. There are legitimate questions about what this means for manufacturing jobs in Ontario. But Carney's government is betting that the benefits of cheap electric vehicles for Canadian consumers and the broader trade gains from China outweigh the risks to one sector. They're betting that Canada can manage this transition and come out stronger. And here's the kicker. Once those Chinese EVs are in Canada, how exactly does the United States plan to keep them from crossing the border? Are they going to inspect every car at the border crossing? Are they going to create a whole new bureaucracy to track which electric vehicles came from China through Canada? The logistics of enforcement are a nightmare. Trump's tariff threats were supposed to protect American manufacturing. What they've actually done is create a situation where Chinese manufacturers get access to North American consumers through Canada, and American companies lose their preferential access to Canadian markets. It's the exact opposite of what was intended. Let's talk about what this means for Canadian agriculture because this is where the immediate economic impact is going to be felt. China just agreed to reduce or eliminate tariffs on canola, lobsters, beef, and peas. These are massive Canadian industries that have been locked out of the Chinese market or facing prohibitive tariffs for years. The canola industry alone represents billions of dollars in potential exports. China is the world's largest importer of canola. Canadian farmers have been desperate for access to that market. They've watched as their crops sit in storage or get sold at a loss because they can't access the buyers who want them. That problem just got solved. Lobster fishermen in Atlantic Canada have been dealing with American tariff threats and market uncertainty for years. They just got access to the wealthiest consumers in Asia who pay premium prices for North American lobster. The economic impact on maritime communities is going to be transformative. Beef producers have been struggling with oversupply in North American markets. Prices have been depressed. Margins have been thin. China consumes more beef than any country on earth, and they pay top dollar for quality Canadian beef. That market just opened up. This is real money flowing to real communities across Canada. This isn't abstract economic theory. This is farmers who were on the brink of bankruptcy suddenly having buyers competing for their products. These are small towns that have been dying for decades suddenly seeing an economic lifeline. And the timing is crucial here. These tariff reductions are happening immediately. This isn't a phased implementation over years. Chinese tariffs on these products are coming down now. Canadian exporters can start shipping now. The economic relief is instantaneous. Compare that to the uncertainty Canadian agriculture has faced from American trade policy. Trump threatened Canadian farmers with tariffs constantly. He used agriculture as a political weapon during NAFTA renegotiations. Canadian farmers never knew from one month to the next whether they'd have access to American markets or face punitive tariffs. China just offered them stability. They offered them a long-term partnership. They offered them respect as trading partners rather than treating them as bargaining chips in political games. Is it any wonder that Canadian agriculture is embracing this deal? Here's what the mainstream coverage is missing. This deal fundamentally alters the strategic balance in North America, and nobody in Washington seems to understand it yet. For 75 years, the United States has been able to assume that Canada would ultimately align with American interests because Canada had no choice. Canadian economic dependence on the U.S. meant that when Washington said jump, Ottawa asked how high. That assumption is now dead. Canada has options. Canada has leverage. Canada can tell the United States no and make it stick because they have alternative markets for their goods and alternative sources for products their consumers want. Think about what this means for future negotiations. The next time there's a dispute over softwood lumber, Canada doesn't have to cave to American demands because Canadian lumber can go to China. The next time there's a fight over dairy or any other protected sector, Canada has more room to stand firm. The next time an American president threatens tariffs, Canada can credibly threaten to deepen ties with China even further. This is a complete reversal of the traditional power dynamic, and it happened because Trump was too arrogant and too stupid to understand that threats only work if the other side has no alternatives. He gave Canada the motivation to find alternatives. He gave them the political cover to pursue those alternatives by being so unreasonable that even traditional allies of the U.S. relationship in Canada couldn't defend American behavior anymore. The national security implications are also staggering. The United States has always assumed that Canada would align with American security interests because of economic integration. That assumption is now questionable. If Canada is economically integrated with China, can the United States still assume Canadian support in a confrontation with China? Can American intelligence agencies still share everything with Canadian counterparts if those counterparts might have economic incentives to maintain good relations with Beijing? These are questions that didn't exist a month ago. They exist now. And they exist because Trump couldn't resist threatening tariffs. So where does this go from here? Because this is just the beginning. Carney's government has stated explicitly that their goal is to dramatically reduce Canadian economic dependence on the United States by 2035. This China deal is the first step. What's step two? Canada is going to be pursuing trade agreements with every major economy that isn't the United States. They're going to be courting India. They're going to be deepening ties with the European Union. They're going to be looking at Southeast Asia. They're going to be exploring opportunities in South America. Every trade relationship that reduces the percentage of Canadian trade that goes to the U.S. is a win for the Carney government strategy. And other countries are watching this very carefully. If Canada successfully diversifies away from American economic dominance, why can't Mexico? Why can't European allies who are tired of American trade bullying? Why can't anyone? Trump's tactics worked when countries believed they had no choice but to accept American terms. Canada just proved that's not true. The American response is going to be fascinating to watch. Does the U.S. try to retaliate? Do they threaten more tariffs? That's already been tried, and it's what caused this situation. Do they try to negotiate? On what basis? Canada now has leverage it didn't have before. Do they try to drive a wedge between Canada and China? Good luck with that. When Canadian farmers are cashing checks from Chinese buyers, the most likely scenario is chaos. Trump doesn't do strategic thinking. He does tantrums. He's going to rage about Canada betraying the United States. He's going to threaten massive retaliation. He's going to demand that Canada cancel the deal. And Canada is going to ignore him because they can now afford to ignore him. And every time Trump escalates, he's going to push Canada further toward China. Every threat will justify more diversification. Every attempt at economic coercion will prove that Canada was right to reduce dependence on American markets. Trump is going to spend the next few years demonstrating why this deal was necessary. Let's zoom out for a minute and look at what this represents in the larger context of global trade and power. For 30 years after the Cold War, the United States operated on the assumption that it was an indispensable nation, that global trade flowed through American-dominated institutions. Those allies had no choice but to accept American leadership because there was no alternative. China has been working for 2 decades to create an alternative system. Belt and Road Initiative, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, trade agreements across Asia and Africa, massive infrastructure investments in developing countries. The goal has always been to create a world where countries have choices beyond accepting American terms. This Canada deal is the first time that strategy has worked with a major Western ally. Canada isn't some developing country that had no choice but to align with whoever offered investment. Canada is a G7 nation, a NATO member, one of America's closest historical allies, and they just chose to align economically with China over maintaining exclusive dependence on the United States. That's a watershed moment. That's the moment when the American-dominated post-Cold War order started to crack. And it happened because American leadership became so toxic, so unreliable, so openly hostile to its own allies that those allies decided they needed insurance against American behavior. Trump did this. Trump's threats, Trump's tariffs, Trump's complete inability to treat allies with basic respect created the conditions where Canada's government could go to its people and say, "We need to reduce our dependence on the United States," and have the Canadian people respond with overwhelming support. This isn't about Canada hating America. Most Canadians don't hate America, but most Canadians are exhausted by American unpredictability. They're tired of every election potentially meaning a complete reversal of trade policy. They're tired of being threatened and bullied. They're tired of their economic fate being determined by whatever mood an American president wakes up in. The China deal offers stability. It offers respect. It offers a relationship where Canada is treated as a partner rather than a subordinate, and Canadians are embracing it. Now, if you're watching this from Canada, you understand why this is important. But let me spell out why this matters even if you don't care about trade policy or international relations. This deal is going to affect your daily life in concrete ways. Electric vehicles are about to get cheaper. If you've been priced out of the EV market, you're going to have affordable options within months. Chinese manufacturers make quality electric vehicles at prices that are half what Western manufacturers charge. You're going to be able to afford the transition to electric transportation. If you work in agriculture or in industries that depend on agriculture, your economic prospects just improve dramatically. Access to Chinese markets means more demand for Canadian products, which means more jobs and higher wages in those sectors. If you're concerned about climate change, this deal accelerates Canada's transition to electric vehicles, which reduces emissions. The environmental benefits are significant. If you're worried about Canadian sovereignty and independence, this deal represents a huge step forward. Canada is no longer economically hostage to American political whims. That's worth celebrating regardless of your political affiliation. But there are also risks, and we should be honest about them. The Canadian auto manufacturing sector is going to face increased competition. Some jobs might be lost. The government is going to need to support workers in that transition. There are legitimate questions about whether Canada is trading one form of dependence for another, and whether economic integration with China comes with political strings attached. These are real concerns and they deserve serious discussion, but they need to be weighed against the benefits and against the reality that the status quo was unsustainable. Canada couldn't continue indefinitely as an economic appendage of the United States, subject to whatever trade policy chaos American politics produced. There's a historical parallel here that's worth considering. In the 1950s and 60s, Canada faced a similar choice about its economic future. Canadian nationalists warned that excessive economic integration with the United States would cost Canada its sovereignty, that Canada would become essentially an economic colony unable to chart its own course. Those warnings were dismissed. The benefits of American market access were too attractive. Canadian businesses made their peace with American dominance, and for decades it worked reasonably well. But it was always a dependent relationship. Canada was always the junior partner. What we're seeing now is a correction of that historical choice, a recognition that the bargain Canada made in the mid-20th century needs to be renegotiated for the 21st. That Canadian prosperity can't be built solely on American market access when American trade policy has become weaponized and unpredictable. Future historians are going to look back at this moment as a turning point. The moment when Canada stopped being a subsidiary of American economic power and became a truly independent trading nation. The moment when decades of increasing integration reversed direction. The moment when North American assumptions about permanent economic alignment broke down. And they're going to identify Trump's tariff threats as the catalyst. His behavior made this politically possible in Canada. His threats gave Canadian leaders the justification they needed to pursue alternatives. His complete misunderstanding of how leverage works created the conditions for Canada to escape American economic dominance. It's almost poetic. Trump wanted to use tariffs to force Canada into submission. Instead, he used tariffs to force Canada into independence. He wanted to demonstrate American power. Instead, he demonstrated American weakness. He wanted to show that Canada had no choice but to accept American terms. Instead, he proved that Canada could thrive by rejecting American terms. Now, every other American ally is watching this and taking notes. If Canada successfully diversifies away from American economic dominance, why can't they? Trump's approach to alliances has been transactional and hostile. He's treated allies as freeloaders and trade relationships as zero-sum competitions that America has been losing. That approach has consequences. Allies who are constantly threatened and disrespected start looking for insurance policies. They start building relationships that reduce their dependence on American markets and American security guarantees. They start hedging their bets. Canada just showed how it's done. They identified their biggest trading vulnerabilities, found alternative markets, and executed a deal that meaningfully reduces their exposure to American trade policy chaos. Other countries are going to follow that playbook. Mexico is probably already having conversations with Chinese officials about similar arrangements. European countries that are tired of American trade threats are going to be exploring their options. Asian allies who are caught between American demands and Chinese economic opportunities are going to be calculating whether they can play both sides the way Canada is now doing. The American global order depended on allies believing they had no choice but to align with the United States. That belief is evaporating. And it's evaporating because American leadership has become so erratic and so hostile that the costs of alignment outweigh the benefits. Trump thinks he's making America strong by throwing his weight around. He's actually making America isolated and irrelevant. He's pushing allies away and giving competitors like China opportunities to expand their influence. He's undermining the very foundations of American power in the name of short-term political posturing. And the tragedy is that it didn't have to be this way. Canada wasn't looking to abandon the American relationship. They were pushed into it. They were threatened into it. Trump created a situation where the only rational response was to reduce dependence on the United States. And then he acts shocked when that's exactly what Canada does. So let's look ahead, because the next few years are going to be turbulent. The United States is not going to accept this gracefully. There will be retaliation attempts. There will be political pressure. There will be demands that Canada choose between the United States and China. and Canada is going to refuse to choose. That's the whole point of this strategy. Canada is building a position where they don't have to choose, where they can maintain relationships with both the United States and China, where they can trade with whoever offers the best terms, where they can pursue their own interests rather than automatically aligning with American preferences. That's going to create friction. The U.S.-Canada relationship is going to go through a very rough period, but Canada is betting that they can weather that friction and come out the other side with more independence and more prosperity. They're betting that the United States ultimately needs Canada more than Canada needs the United States. They're betting that American threats are empty because the U.S. can't actually afford to cut Canada off. And they're probably right. The United States and Canada share the longest undefended border in the world. They have integrated supply chains across multiple industries. They share resources, infrastructure, and security arrangements. The idea that the United States could truly decouple from Canada is fantasy, which means Canada can pursue this strategy with reasonable confidence that the worst-case scenarios won't materialize. Meanwhile, Canadian businesses are going to be exploring Chinese markets aggressively. Canadian exporters who've been shut out of China are going to be ramping up. Chinese companies are going to be investing in Canada. The economic integration between Canada and China is going to deepen year by year. And 20 years from now, we're going to look back at this moment as the turning point, the moment when the assumption of permanent North American economic integration died, the moment when Canada became truly economically independent, the moment when American dominance of the Western Hemisphere ended, all because Trump couldn't resist threatening tariffs, all because American leadership became so toxic that the closest ally America had decided it needed an exit strategy, all because the arrogance of American power finally pushed a patient ally too far. This is what decline looks like. Not a sudden collapse, but a steady erosion of influence as allies decide they don't need to tolerate American behavior anymore. As alternatives emerge, and those alternatives start looking more attractive than dealing with American dysfunction. Canada just took the first step, others will follow, and the American-dominated world order that emerged after World War II will fade into history, replaced by something more multipolar, more balanced, and less dependent on American approval. That's the real story here, not just a trade deal, not just tariffs and electric vehicles, but the end of an era, the end of American dominance over its closest ally, the beginning of a new chapter where Canada charts its own course, and it happened because Trump gave them no choice.